Well, welcome back. And again, I want to give another shout out to the NAU folks who got up so early, took the bus down here and have been present all day. And thanks to Robin and Carl and Saba, Pedro, and all the NAU people. So I'm very excited about this panel. It's what I wrote my dissertation on. In fact, Professor Hirsch's work really transformed it, her work on post-memory. So I'm very excited to have Professor Marianne Hirsch here. And we have our own illustrious and luminary Don Fixico here, and as well, Arianne, Ishayu, and my friend Ramina here from the Seyfo Center always brings such wonderful people to events and exhibitions to the conference. So thank you, Ramina, again. So I'm going to turn it over to you, and it's going to be a fantastic panel, guaranteed.
Thank you so much, Tim, for that fantastic and fabulous introduction. My name is Ramina Jajoo-Frindrich. I'm the president of Seyfo Center, Arizona chapter. We're also known as the Assyrian Genocide Research Center. In 1914, the government of Ottoman Turkey decided that they're going to persecute Assyrians, Armenians, and Greeks. My paternal grandparents lost 20 members of their families. That makes me a third-generation genocide survivor. Therefore, it gives me great pleasure, and it's an honor to be introducing the next panel. Thank you for keeping your cell phones muted. Thank you for writing down your notes and your questions. Each panel presenter will spend about 20 minutes presenting, and then we will take Q&A session. We'll do a Q&A session after each presentation. So bear with us. Also, the Assyrian community has put an exhibit together at the Noble Library on the second floor, which is a 5-minute walk from here. I invite you to visit it. It will stay open till April 10th. The title of the next presentation is Intergenerational Memory. This panel explores intergenerational trauma, intergenerational memory, and post-memory. Our first presenter, joining us by Zoom, is Professor Marianne Hirsch. Professor Hirsch is William Peterfield Trent Professor Emerita of Comparative Literature and Gender Studies at Columbia University. She writes about the transmission of memories of violent histories across generations, a process she has termed post-memory. Her recent books include The Generation of Post-Memory, Writing and Visual Culture After the Holocaust, Ghosts of Home, The Afterlife of Chernovitz in Jewish Memory, and School Photos in Liquid Time, Reframing Difference, both co-authored with Leo Spitzer, as well as the co-edited volume, Women Mobilizing Memory, published in 2019. She is currently working on a book about reparative memory. Professor Hirsch is a former president of the Modern Language Association of America and a member of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences. The topic of her presentation is Rethinking Post-Memory in the Current Moment. Please join me in welcoming Professor Hirsch.
Hello. Okay, thank you. Well, hello, everyone. I'm so sorry to be on Zoom and not to be with you in person for this really important conference. I think I'm really glad to be speaking on the occasion of Genocide Awareness Week, such an important conversation to be having right now. And I think the Rosenbluth Family Foundation is doing a really important thing in sponsoring this. I'm glad to be here today specifically because I think we're at a moment of crisis. We're at a moment of crisis specifically in the field of genocide studies, or as it is often called, Holocaust and genocide studies. We're observing Genocide Awareness Week, even as we're witnessing what I believe are two ongoing genocides in Sudan and in Gaza. And it's my role here to speak specifically about Holocaust memory, and particularly the transmission of Holocaust memory across generation. And I really welcome the idea of doing this on this comparative, multi-directional, connective panel where we're speaking about different genocides in relation to each other. I think the crisis that I'm referring to has to do with the role of the Holocaust today in this discussion of genocide awareness, what role it has played in the definition of genocide, and how that role might have changed, how we might define it today. And I'm thinking specifically about how an exceptionalist understanding of the Holocaust, its characterization as a crime of all crimes, has been used as a measure of what constitutes genocide, and how that might impede or make more difficult, rather than clarifying, an understanding of other genocides. I was really very happy or feel it's really important, for example, to talk about the Assyrian genocide, which is actually not as often recognized or acknowledged. I'm also concerned with how the pervasive influence of extreme trauma that for a long time has dominated the discussion of Holocaust victimization might have encouraged this kind of exceptionalist view, and thus that our understanding of the process that I've discussed as post-memory, and I'll speak a little bit more about that, might inadvertently have contributed to this crisis. So I've been doing a lot of rethinking of my work in the last year and a half or so. As myself a child of Holocaust survivors and a scholar of the memory and its memory of the Holocaust and its transgenerational transmission, I'm not surprised by the prominence that the specter of the Holocaust has assumed in the aftermath of the horrific attacks by Hamas on October 7th, 2023. But I'm disturbed to see how the Holocaust, how accusations of anti-Semitism, how my own family's persecution is being used right now as an alibi for the brutal violence that's been committed against the people in Gaza, with over 50,000 people killed, among them tens of thousands of civilians and notably children. I myself came to my work on trauma and memory from my feminist, anti-racist, anti-colonial, anti-military commitments, and that was a very long time ago in the late 1980s. And it was a moment when we turned to the past, and that turn to the past for me and for my colleagues who were engaged in this field was part of an intellectual and political project that was dedicated to critiquing and enlarging the present, to contesting official histories, to making space for suppressed or forgotten voices that might enlarge the historical archive. But for us, many of us, that turn was also personal, and that is my story. I still vividly remember the moment when I first began to wonder why certain stories that my parents had told me, or scenes that they had evoked about what they always referred to as the war, were more vibrant and more vivid in my memories than moments I recalled from my own childhood. Their stories, and my parents spoke a lot. I know a lot of people who've gone through what they went through were silent over, many decades. Parents spoke a lot. Their stories had the texture and the qualities of memories for me, but they were clearly not my memories. They were transmitted incompletely and indirectly. They left space for imagination, investment, projection, creation for my own fantasies. And still, I felt that events that I had not myself experienced, that preceded my birth, shaped my past and my present, and somehow were also determining my future, and maybe also that of my children and now my grandchildren. Starting with the Holocaust, my work has focused on this fraught transmission of traumatic histories across generation, on their powerful and vivid, yet also belated and mediated, temporally and qualitatively moved qualities. And I needed a term for why this thing that felt like memory that wasn't memory. I needed a term to define that. And the term that I came up with and have used, and that others have used, is post-memory. Post-memory in the sense of after, but also a little bit like a Post-it note that you stick on something, if it falls off, that something, that memory is still affected by it. It can't completely come off. In recent years, neuroscientists have substantiated these accounts of children of survivors of violent histories by showing how trauma can be transmitted across generations epigenetically. So parental trauma can be encoded in children's epigenetic materials, not genetic, not the DNA, but the lining of the gene that can be imprinted by environmental factors. And in this way, for example, Rachel Yehuda, a neuroscientist in New York, has argued that descendants of Holocaust survivors, for example, that was her case, become more vulnerable to traumatic and post-traumatic stress symptoms. But this research is in its very, very beginnings, and it's not yet conclusive, but it does corroborate the accounts of members of the post-generations, as the novelist and writer Eva Hoffman has called it, and the memories, the oral accounts, the literature, and the art that people in the second and third generation, not just of the Holocaust, but of many violent histories have produced. So I thought we would look at a couple of such works of art in order for me to be able to illustrate what I'm talking about here. And let me try to share my screen and hope that works. Well, I'm not exactly seeing. Let me see if this works at all. Oh, okay. Sorry, this is going to take me a second. Okay, I wanted to show you this work by the Argentinian artist Mirta Kupfermink, who is the daughter of Holocaust survivors. And this is an etching that she made in 1991, which is called En Camino, in the road. And I think what it illustrates for me is the weight of the past that we carry with us. As you can see, these people are moving forward. They're kind of suspended in a plane without really a ground to walk on. And they're wandering. They're refugees. They're carrying their villages. They're carrying books. They're carrying entire villages with them. And they're carrying trees. This journey is not linear. Some people are looking ahead. Some of them are looking backward. They're certainly very weighted down by the past. They're looking forward and they're looking back. And this is a story of exile, of displacement after catastrophe. And in this story, the uprooted trees signify a removal from home, a violent break in the continuity from the past, a break in genealogy, a break in generation. But trees, when they get uprooted, they contain the knowledge of the past that they've absorbed through the nourishment from the soil. They can carry it into the future. But if trees are uprooted for too long, they will die and they will obliterate generations of history and of memory. But in this etching, humans blend into trees. They replace the roots. They become embodied archives of a past knowledge that they attempt with difficulty to carry forward and to transmit. So in this etching, I think memory, the past, is an overwhelming burden. It's as Eva Hoffman, the writer, has written, a beautiful gift and a relentless curse. And this image, to me, shows the question of how to transmit embodied trauma and loss, how to transmit the libraries and the archives that have been lost, how to carry the past forward. What is in these boxes? What is in these archives? What knowledge do these bodies carry? And what are they transmitting to us? And then what is our responsibility in listening to their stories and looking at their stories? Kupfermink later in 2020, so this is some years later, made this image, which is called All of Them With Me. And you can see that the tree is still a really important motif here. It's a photograph that she's inherited from her family in Poland that they brought along. And then you also see a picture of her as a schoolgirl, completely overwhelmed by this photograph from the past. And you see here also a school photo of her, but the books that were carried by those figures. And then there's this stain of the past kind of bleeding into the present. And I think that what we see here is the post memory that seeps through the wall, that she is responsible for, or continues to carry the responsibility for, these trees that have been replanted in Argentina, but that still their family trees, their genealogies. But as you can see, they've been completely broken up here. And she, as a little schoolgirl, always has all of them with her. I'm going to unshare for a minute so we can see each other a little bit better. And whoops. And then I will share again and show you how this work has actually evolved over the decades in Mirta Kupferming's work. So it's precisely, it seems to me, the powerful ways that I think Kupferming's work illustrates that the past has been transmitted, can be transmitted across multiple generations, the ways trauma has been transmitted across multiple generations, that has allowed many to claim that to inherit the legacies of these violent histories, especially of the Holocaust, in the second, third, and subsequent generations, is to oneself suffer from transgenerational trauma, and thus the vulnerability of a forever victimhood, one that's contagious and pervasive, even for those who have no direct relationship to this catastrophic history. But I think what we need to ask is, without denying the severity of the trauma suffered by victims, survivors, and descendants, can the arc of trauma be redirected so it does not enable continuing cycles of violence? And my question is, what approach to painful memories might be able to offer an opening toward a different future? What kind of memory could prevent rather than cause repetitive violence by making us feel so vulnerable and so traumatized? How can we retrieve not only the trauma of the past, but also maybe its potentialities, however unrealized? But in fact, in recent years, many memory scholars, artists, and practitioners and activists have been able to contest the inevitability of traumatic return. We've been seeing a turn toward practices of communal healing, of repair, toward activist interventions and visions of a more just future that might be built on the interconnections of different histories rather than on competition over suffering and the focus on one history alone. And I think this conference, this Genocide Awareness Week, is a wonderful example of this turn toward a relational kind of memory. And, myself as a scholar of the Holocaust and a child of Holocaust survivors, I've learned a great deal from the very different orientations toward histories and memories of violent histories and memories of enslavement, of colonialism, of racism, of dictatorship, of war and genocide that distinguish diverse regions of the globe where I've worked. And I believe that such a comparative or connective approach, one that can relate without conflating diverse histories and grant each still its own local specificity, even while putting them next to each other, that such an approach can reclaim the critical edge that memory studies and practices can have. And I think that they also risk losing as they become institutionalized in both national and global contexts. So the question is, what does memory do? What can memory do in different present circumstances and in anticipation of what one would like to be better futures? How can memory enable us to see not only our own painful history, but those of others, and how can we see their interrelation? Such broader relational perspectives have come to modulate the scope of traumatic repetition and return. They've left openings for accounts of individual and collective healing, of activist resistance, and I believe also to forms of cultural repair. So let me go back now to another share, if you will bear with me, so that we could look at share. How some of this work in Kupfermink has evolved. This is a much more recent 2018 image in which she has recast the boat or the wandering, the story of wandering, and placed it into a boat that goes from a port in Poland to a port in Argentina where she actually ended up. But as you can see here, the boat is actually not going in that direction. It's moving forward. It's suspended in space and time, and some of the figures have been left behind. It's very tenuous. It's very potential. It's small, but this story has evolved to become a story of the migrant crisis that we've been facing for the last decades and more. I think placing these people into a boat is a significant allusion to the boats that are crossing the seas with migrants who are carrying their villages and their trees with them toward new destinations, but the difficulty and maybe the inability to reach those destinations. So I'm seeing here the kind of connectivity that I've been trying to evoke for you. And in another image, also from 2018, which is called The Archaeology of a Journey, Kupfermink has transformed this image, which in this garishly colored sea, into, with the Japanese technique of kintsugi, which incorporates damage and breakage into an image. So if something breaks, instead of trying to fix it so you can't see the breaks, it incorporates the breaks. And here with gold leaf, that's the Japanese technique of kintsugi. So it shows the artist and the practices of art and the practices of memory as a potentially reparative practice. But we also see that the frame of the image can no longer contain the trauma and the memories that are carried here. These suspended lives, these stateless lives, they're interconnected with one another, but they explode out of the image. And I think it's a very powerful way to show the potentiality of repair and our responsibility in carrying, in inheriting these difficult histories and receiving the past, but also the people in the boat who are not just in the past, but also in the present. So let me try to conclude, and this is another image called Solidarity by the artist Lori Novak. Let me try to conclude by asking, what are the responsibilities that come with this fraught transmission? For generational descendants of the Holocaust or other traumatic histories, especially for those of us who are familial descendants of survivors, in my case of the Holocaust, I think the weighty inheritance of such extreme trauma comes with an important caution, and that's what I've been specifically conscious of now, the consciousness that no matter how immediate it feels, no matter how much we identify and empathize, our post-memory is vicarious. We were not there. It was their story. It was not our story. We are not second-generation survivors. We are descendants of survivors. Our post-memories do not grant us the status of victims. It's a status we have to refuse so we can benefit from the distance to think and to act in solidarity with others and act for the future. We have to refuse that conflation and the continued traumatization so that it not be used to victimize others, as we've been seeing. So my question is, can a turn to a relational memory and a turn to possibilities of healing and repair offer a way to contest the confusions and contagions that we've seen in the use of Holocaust memory since October 7th, 2023? Can it foster not just identification and empathy with the victims and the survivors, but also solidarity and accompaniment across borders and across histories? Can it offer ways to interrupt the inevitability of traumatic return that shadows the effects of post-memory? I think we need to understand and to emphasize, again, as I just said, that it was their story, it's not our story, but it's a story we are here to witness and to transmit, but not to relive. And I think this distinction has become especially crucial for me in the present moment. I think one lesson we've learned from the violence of the 20th and the 21st centuries, of which the Holocaust was a part, is that our futures depend on confronting our painful and traumatic pasts, but to do so not as victims, but I would say as world citizens in solidarity with others. Confronting the traumas we've inherited in this way, I think, is a first step to enable their transformation in the present and in the future. Memory practices can open up the past and reframe its debilitating legacies. By dislodging entrenched embodied responses to painful remembrance, it can become a transformative practice of communal connection and a platform for social solidarity. Thank you.
Take audience questions. Please raise your hand so we can bring the microphone to you so Professor Hirsch can hear you.
Thank you for your lecture. My name is George. I'm kind of associate with what you went through. My dad was an orphan, and all his family was wiped out in World War I. So I don't have any relative from my father's side. All his family has been wiped out in World War I. So as a descendant of the genocide, what's your recommendation for, is there anything you recommend for kind of like a way of therapy or helping the descendant of the next generation genocide, like a therapy?
Thank you for this really difficult question. I think what I would recommend is speaking with others who are maybe not necessarily descendants of the same history, but I think we all share a certain symptoms, certain syndrome. And I think one of the things we can do is try to do something in the present with our painful histories, fight for social justice for others, fight for never again for anyone, but then also for ourselves. I've been facilitating some groups that are related to the coronavirus pandemic and the devastating losses, especially here in New York City and my very neighborhoods and the very neighborhood that Columbia's located in. And we all read Bessel van der Kolk's book, The Body Keeps the Score, where he argues that through being together, through discussing our histories, through various kinds of group activities and therapies, we not only can change the present and the future, but we could also change the past. We can imagine a different past that might have been. And so those are some of the things that I've been trying out, and happy to correspond with you about more if you'd like.
Any other questions or questions from the chat? No? Oh, we have two, so.
Hi, I noticed that you have MetaMouse and Mouse Now in the back on your bookshelf. Do you feel as though these books historically depict history accurately, or is there something you would change in these books?
Well, Mouse is what got me started in thinking about post-memory, because I read it when it first came out, and Art Spiegelman is pretty much my age. He's a little bit older. His father was a survivor. I mean, his parents went through much more than my parents. They were in Auschwitz. My parents were survivors of the ghetto and forced labor. It was a very different story. But the way that he depicts, tries to get into their story by fragmenting it, by transforming it, by asking hard questions, by trying to tell it in ways that, sort of figure the difficulty of understanding it, just really, really spoke to me. And I very much identified with his quest. I think it's meticulously researched, and it's incredibly perceptive. And you see it in the book itself, where he not only listens to his father talk into a tape recorder, but he tries to draw the things that his father describes, and then researches those places. He went to the places. So I think you can actually, and I've taught it many times, you could actually teach quite a bit of the history of the Holocaust by reading Mouse. It's called a graphic novel, but he himself rejected that term. He was given a Pulitzer Prize for fiction, and he insisted that this is not fiction. So they had to create a special category in the Pulitzer for him to win it. That was not fiction. So I would call it a graphic memoir, not a graphic novel.
So I was wondering, especially within certain communities, there's this, not within the entire community, but within certain segments of every community, there's kind of this initial rejection of the idea that you can compare different genocides, or usually it'll be kind of that one person that someone will hold up a genocide that their own people went through as being like as something that needs to be focused on. And what do you think is the best way of helping people realize that it's not about, lessening the focus on one, but expanding the focus on all?
Great question, like all the others. I don't actually, I was trained in comparative literature, so the word compare is sort of part of my DNA right now, but I don't actually like the idea of comparative genocide or comparative histories. I've been calling it connective, because comparative sort of implies that you can compare. These are all really unique. Each one of these histories is really unique and has its very own trajectory. And yet they are connected by certain structures of persecution, of survival, of resistance, of aftermath. But they're also connected by large geopolitical histories of imperialism, of colonialism, of racism, of genocidal violence that states can commit, state-sponsored violence. So understanding those connections is really important in understanding each one, and yet we have to grant each one its own space, and each of these populations their own ways of coping with the past. A lot depends on acknowledgement. So the Armenian genocide has actually never been acknowledged by the perpetrators, by Turkey, and so re-traumatization happens on every generation when the past is not acknowledged. So each of those factors of the kind of acknowledgement, the kind of reparations that are made possible, but also how these histories still reverberate and resonate in the present, have a great impact. And right now, what I'm concerned about is that, the Holocaust is being used as an alibi for what I believe is a genocide in the present. And that also impacts the history of the Holocaust. So going forward, we will have to take that into account. And I'm not sure how comparable that is to other situations like this. So I think we have to grant each one its own integrity, and yet the connections are really, really important.
Thank you. Okay, we have time. Do we have time for one more question or no? Okay, so we have to move on. Okay, please join me in thanking Professor Hirsch. Thank you so much for Professor Hirsch.
Thank you all, and I look forward to the next papers.
Our next speaker is Professor Donald L. Fixico. Professor Fixico is Shawnee, Sac, and Fox, Muskogee Creek, and Seminole. He is a Regents and Distinguished Foundation Professor of History, Distinguished Scholar of Sustainability in the Wrigley Global Institute, and affiliate faculty in American Indian Studies at Arizona State University. He has had postdoctoral fellowships at UCLA and the Newberry Library in Chicago. Previously, he was the Thomas Bolus Distinguished Professor at the University of Kansas and has had 7 visiting professorships, including the John Rhodes Visiting Professor of Public Policy and American Institutions in the Barrett Honors College at ASU, as well as visiting professorship in the John F. Kennedy Institute for North American Studies and at Freie University in Berlin, Germany. He has written and edited 18 books on American Indians and the West and has worked on more than 25 documentaries. In 2018, he served as the president of the Western History Association. The title of his presentation is Remembering Genocide and Intergenerational Memory for American Indians. This presentation shares the inner trauma of how Native people feel about the U.S. killing Indians, displacing them, and how they deal with the trauma of genocide on the outside. Please help me welcome Professor Fixico.
Okay. Thank you for that wonderful introduction. Actually, I sent in a shorter bio. This is amazing. This room is so packed with people. You know, we actually hold our school faculty meetings here, and we don't get that many people in the room to show up. And those are historians and philosophers and religious studies scholars. And so it's just, you can feel the energy in this room, and it is just wonderful. I'm going to do something a little bit different today because I'm actually going to read to you. And it always kind of struck me that, you know, when I see a Native scholar reading a paper, because we come from an oral tradition, it just kind of goes against the grain. But I've not thought enough or written about what I'm talking about today, so I'm going to have to rely on my notes, and so hope that you'll just bear with me. I'm not the best reader. I'm sure that we have some basketball fans and what's going on at the Final Four and all of that, and so that's been settled. And so I want to thank the people who organize all this because it's a lot of hard work. I want to begin my remarks by talking about pep talks before a big college football game. In my house, college football is a religion. In 1928, on November 10, it was Notre Dame versus Army. The legendary coach Newt Rockne gave his famous pep talk to his players to win one for the giver. At halftime, it was a cold 20 degrees and neither team had scored a point. In the third quarter, Army went ahead 6-0, but Notre Dame fought back to win 12-6 in Yankee Stadium, where this historic game was played. Halftime, 20 degrees. By the time they ended the game, it was 14 degrees. But today I want to tell you about another pep talk. This was the game between Carlisle Indian School against Army at West Point in New York on November 9, 1912. For those of you who might not know, Carlisle was an Indian boarding school started in 1879 by Army Captain Richard Pratt. For the Army football team, Dwight D. Eisenhower played left halfback, and he also played on defense for the Army team. The famous Indigenous athlete, Jim Thorpe, played for Carlisle. The legendary coach, Pop Warner, coached the Indian boarding school team. And before the game started, Coach Warner gathered his players around him and gave a very short and direct pep talk. As he pointed at the Army team, he said, think about this to his players. Think about this. Remember that their grandfathers killed your grandfathers. That day, the Indians won a victory, and they beat Army 27-6 before a crowd of 3,000 at West Point. and Carlisle went on to an undefeated season. With the expansion of Manifest Destiny, the United States government authorized over 1,000 wars, attacks, and skirmishes against Indian people. From 1796 to the start of the 20th century, the Indian population in the 48-state area of the United States dropped below 238,000. Comparatively, from an original estimated population of 50 million Native people in North America, this reduction to 238,000 is a horrendous loss. This was almost extinction. Most of this huge depletion was due to more than a dozen diseases introduced to Native people. In his book, Writing History, Writing Trauma, Dominic LaCapra tells us everybody is subject to structural trauma. But with respect to historical trauma and its representation, the distinction between victims and perpetrators and bystanders is crucial. When you study trauma studies, these are the three roles: victims, perpetrators, and bystanders. But there's a fourth role that's developed, and that person is the perpetrator who is guilty. So the guilty perpetrator, because they come back and they feel guilty for what they've done. In his conclusion, LaCapra wrote, "Writing trauma is often seen in the terms of enacting it, which may at times be equated with acting or playing it out in performative discourse or artistic practice. From an Indian point of view, what did trauma feel like? In the most well-known book on American Indians, D. Brown wrote, 'Bury My Heart at Wounded Knee,' the Indian history of the American West, published in 1971. The book has sold over 5 million copies in 17 different languages." I have to stop here because, every time I read that, or think of that statement, every person I know in Native history as a field wish that they had written that book. Even Bandalori Jr., and if you know the name Bandalori Jr., just poured out books. The only scholar I know that's published 4 books in 1 year. If you know anybody who's done that, let me know. D. Brown was a humble librarian from Louisiana, and he wrote in the introduction of this book, "I have tried to fashion a narrative of the conquest of the American West as the victims experienced it, using their own words whenever possible. Americans who have always looked westward when reading about this period should read this book facing eastward from a Native perspective." Most writers of Indian wars never realize that they are writing about the pain of trauma that Indian people feel. The 3 important points about the so-called Indian wars that I want to stress is that there is trauma, memory, and how do we deal with this emotional history? I believe that we deal with it from the inside and the outside. Native people grieve within their communities and within families and within oneself. Inside of us, Native people are conscious of what has been done to Indian people, and we carry our grief with us wherever we go. It is with us all the time. It is forever. Therapy teaches us to compartmentalize this trauma, but in our own way, we hold ceremonies to cope. But the memory events of genocide are still there. Such horrific memories include the mass hanging of 38 Santee Sioux at Mankato, Minnesota, the Sand Creek Massacre of Cheyennes and Arapahoes in 1864, Washita in 1868, Wounded Knee in 1890, and other atrocities became a part of the oral tradition of Native groups. Notable stories, even bad ones, have been told and retold around campfires among generations of families, relatives, and friends. Our stories of massacres and death refuels the trauma that is traumatic neurosis, as described by Kathy Carruth in Unclaimed Experience, a book published in 1986. The concern here is that the genocidal trauma does not go away unless you have absolutely no knowledge of the past Indian wars in which Native people are to be blamed. This is historical amnesia. We resist it. But if you look at this from a Native point of view, it was Indian people who patriotically defended their people and homelands, like the American patriots fighting for their freedom in the Revolutionary War against England. Native people have fought many patriotic battles to save friends and relatives and homelands. But how do outsiders, as non-Indians, know how we feel? It is people like the Jewish communities who really, truly understand what it is like. Writing about the past largely is a mainstream privilege, starting with Frederick Jackson Turner and his frontier thesis. Also, the development of movies, starting with Thomas Edison's 42nd silent movie in 1893. It was titled The Sioux Ghost Dance. It was made only 3 years after the Wounded Knee Massacre in 1890. Edison's invention of the silent movie helped to start the Hollywood movie industry while advancing Turner's winning of the West. This technology and the movie industry launched a new media of killing Indians over and over and over in Western films like Custer of the West, The Searchers, and other films. In an interview, movie director John Ford said, "I've killed more Indians than Custer, Beecher, and Chevington put together. And the people in Europe want to know more about American Indians." From 1917 to 1970, John Ford directed 145 movies that included 56 Westerns. The wild savage shown in movie theaters and on television have amplified the trauma for Native people. Even before films, dime novels introduced in 1861 until the 1920s described Native people on the frontier that had to be defeated in the name of Christianity and civilization. Over 1,000 movies and TV episodes have shown Indians being killed. At this point, I want to talk about the outside of how Native people deal with trauma from the outside. 3 examples of remembering genocide and intergenerational memory for American Indians include these 3 following memorial events. The first one. Every year, the Chief Bigfoot Memorial Ride is held in December for a 14-day ride on horseback covering 300 miles. This ride starts on the Cheyenne River Reservation to Wounded Knee in South Dakota. The ride is held to tell the indigenous side of the massacre, and so that people will not forget Chief Bigfoot, who led 350 ghost dancers to surrender. And after a second search for weapons, Bigfoot's people were massacred by the 7th Cavalry of 470 soldiers who used 4 Hotchkiss guns, rapid-firing guns that shot 68 bullets per minute. Second memorial event. Since 2005, the annual Dakota 38+2 Memorial Ride has been held, covering 330 miles. The horseback ride starts at the Lower Relay Reservation in South Dakota and ends in Minnesota at Mankato. The Dakota Memorial Ride is held so that people will not forget the largest single-day mass execution in American history. Imagine, they built 40 gallows, but that day, 38 Santee Sioux were hung at once. The only time it's ever happened in American history. On December 26th, that's one day after Christmas, 3,000 people gathered in the town square of Mankato to watch the 38 hung. They were blamed for causing the Minnesota War of 1862, and 3 years later, 2 more Santee Sioux were executed. Third memorial event. Almost every year, the annual Cherokee Bike Ride follows the route of the Trail of Tears from Newshoto, Georgia to Tahlequah, Oklahoma, the capital of the Cherokee Nation. The route covers 950 miles and it first began in 1984. That was over 40 years ago. In 2024, there were 17 bike riders in the Remember the Removal bike ride. And why did they do this? Back in 1838, 16,000 Cherokees were marched along the Trail of Tears and an estimated 4,000 died. For the 5 tribes, Cherokees, Chickasaws, Choctaws, Muskogees, and Seminoles, over 66,000 were removed by force and 15,000 died along the way. By 1850, the government had moved 100,000 Native people from their homelands to an estimated 275 reservations. Indian removal continued until the late 1800s when an estimated 300 tribes had reservations. On my father's side, I am Muskogee and I'm Seminole, and I was raised in that tradition. And we remember the Trail of Tears. The Cherokees call it the Trail of Tears, but Muskogee people and the Seminoles, we speak the same language. We call it the Road of Suffrage. Part of our creation myth is that we come from the ground, and we come from the ground to the surface. And in coming from the ground to the surface, how do you do that when it's totally dark? You would hold the hand of the person in front of you, and so you come out as a group. And as the people in this creation myth then reached the surface, they couldn't see. And so there's a mist that they felt, and they had never felt this mist before the first time. And this wind blew the mist away, and the people could see for the very first time. And they saw animals, creatures, other beings that they'd never seen before. And so some people studied the wolves, and they became the wolf clan. Others studied the bear, and they became the bear clan, and the other animals, and so forth. But on the Trail of Tears, now I'll have to forget one thing, let's backtrack a little bit. When we dance, we start about midnight, 12:30, and we dance till dawn, the new day. And in that, we sing and we dance around a fire. And as we do that, then we welcome the dawn. Our prophecy by the Owalas, the prophets say that everything that's going to happen will come from the east. That's what our Owalas, our prophets, say. And so if you can imagine this, that on the Trail of Tears in this march, what did the people do? They marched, they walked together, and they sang. They sang a song, and a couple of verses go like this. We don't know what's going to happen. We just know that we need to keep moving. And they sang that song over and over. There's other verses to it, but they sang that over and over and over. Now, they did that to be in the Trail of Tears as a group trying to support each other in the marching, as they saw people die along the way, the elderly, the young ones, freezing to death, cholera, dysentery, other diseases that struck them down. But by being together and singing, that's what we know enabled us to survive the Trail of Tears. I have 3 relatives from my own research that I've documented who walked on the Trail of Tears. My oldest Seminole relative, Fixico, my last name, actually, it's, and I'll share this with you as I'm coming to an end here. It's actually, Fixico is actually a war title, and it means heartless in battle. Usually I tell that to my students before the first exam. And so you had to be strong, and you looked towards each other, because as you were about to fall down on the trail, then others picked you up and you kept moving as a group. My conclusion is actually a question. And the question is, why do most Americans ignore the trauma of Native people and think it's okay for children to play cowboys and Indians? Because of the neglect in the mainstream society for the feeling or the feelings of other people, parents think it's okay for their children to play cowboys and Indians. It's not a game. The Comanche scholar, Dr. Cornell Peeweeworthy, said playing cowboys and Indians is playing genocide. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Fixico, for that enlightening presentation. And I think I butchered Muskogee completely, right? We're going to take some questions. We want to stay on track. Any questions for Professor Fixico? We have one there. Yes. No? Should we? Okay. I guess we'll move on. Thank you again. Our next speaker is Dr. Arianne Ishayu. Dr. Ishayu is a distinguished scholar and historian specializing in Middle Eastern studies. She has authored 2 significant studies on immigrant communities titled New Lamps for Old, focusing on North Battleford, Canada, and Familiar Faces in Unfamiliar Places, which explores the history of Assyrian immigration and settlement in California's Central Valley. In addition to publishing numerous articles in academic journals and encyclopedias, she authored William Daniel, Assyrian poet and composer, a biography of the renowned Assyrian literary figure, published by the Assyrian American Association of San Jose in 2015. Her other works include a 2022 reprint of William Daniel's Qatina Gabara trilogy. She also has translated several books from Farsi and Assyrian into English, including The Last Days of Atlakandi by Eddie Dawood and The History of the Assyrian Nation in the 20th Century by Kurush Yacob Shimon, both published in 2022. Currently, she has 3 manuscripts in production, and they are A Brief History of Assyrians in Hamadan, the History of Assyrians in Kermanshah, and A Brief History of Assyrians in Santa Clara Valley, California. Dr. Ishayu holds a PhD in cultural anthropology from UCLA. The title of her talk is Rise from Ashes. This presentation addresses the question of what happened to the children of the Assyrian genocide based on eyewitness or personal accounts. Please help me welcome Dr. Ishayu.
Hello, friends. First, I want to thank Dr. Ramina, Jajoo, and the organizers of this conference for inviting me and making me part of it. In speaking about the Syrian genocide, the focus has been mainly on the adult generation. Today, I want to shift the focus to what happened to the children of the Syrian genocide. This is because the survival of a nation is not dependent on its material assets alone, like its land, mineral, and animal resources. It's equally dependent on its human resources, such as manpower, educators, professional, intellectual classes, and political and spiritual leaders. Children compose the human resources of the next generation. So we want to know what happened to the children of the Assyrian genocide and how this affected their descendants. I have used quotes from several sources to give you a brief sketch of the horror stories about the children of the Assyrian genocide and the remarkable resilience and comeback we witnessed in the descendants of those who survived. 2/3 of the Assyrian nation perished during World War I. Children composed a large portion due to their vulnerability to disease exposure and starvation. We start with children that perished. Eyewitness report from Siirt, Turkey. One day, the Muslims began to gather all children between the ages of 6 and 15 and led them to the police commissioner's office. From there, these poor little children were brought to a mountainous area called Ras al-Hajjar and killed. Their corpses were thrown into a mountain porch. This comes from Dr. Gabriel Yonan, Leslie Parish. Report about the abbot Paul Bedar, Zakhu. This is from northern Iraq. During the forced evacuation of the Assyrian Chaldean Christians, a number of children fell to the ground from fear. They were trampled over and crushed. Refugee children, this is from that order is not correct. Anyway, so I will be reading from the PowerPoint. The Assyrian children were sold for 1 Mejidiya each. Some were sold in exchange for clothes, a basket of fruit, or a chicken. This is the fate of the girls who survived. Young women were raped, and little girls were deflowered in a most brutal way. This comes from Johanna, PhD, The Death of a Nation. We have an eyewitness account on the This is on the road to deportation. There were more than 1,000 women, young girls, and children under 6. Only a few were 12 or 13 years old. We had a few possessions with us, mostly blankets. 4 gendarmes accompanied us. All of us were on foot. During the rest stops, they fell upon us, searched out the prettiest young girls and women and abused them. Many of my relatives were among them, and I too was not spared. Several Kurds who continued to accompany us along the way suddenly assaulted 2 or 3 young girls who were with us and raped them before our eyes. Dr. Gabriel Yonan, lest we perish. There was a gender preference of boys over girls. This is a personal account. We fled behind the retreating Russian troops. I was 4 and my sister was 2. My mother took me on her back and my sister in her arms. But after walking a couple of blocks, my mother returned and left my sister with my grandmother because she could not carry us both. My grandma had a house full of furniture, an orchard, and vineyards. She would not part from them. She thought no one would harm an old woman, but she was mistaken. All those who remained behind were killed. That's from my book, Familiar Faces and Unfamiliar Places. The special case of girls that were abducted. Many attractive girls and young women were forcibly taken into harems. Many others were promised their lives on accepting Islam if they would merely pronounce its formula and adjure Christ. But instead of doing so, with few exceptions, they gave their souls to God and their bodies to their tormentors, defying hell itself by their boundless trust in God and Jesus Christ. From Haftavan alone, more than 500 women and girls were handed over to the Kurds in Savujbulak. From Yohanan, Death of a Nation. Another case of abduction, 4,000 Assyrian women from the Hakkari and Urmia region were kept in bondage in the homes of Muslims. Some of the orphans that were rescued, let's see how they survived. In 1917, the total Assyrian of the Urmia region was 3,900 families, comprising 15,669 persons. Of these, 1,350 were orphans. And we go down the line, and the total comes to about 4,000 of these were orphan children. Some of the girls were rescued. We have Judith Khanem, the wife of Ghashayagu David of Seir, that's in Iran. She did a heroic act. She was highly respected in the community. She collected money from townspeople and bought back some of the abducted girls from the Kurds. Near East Relief maintains small orphanages at Tabriz, Hamadan, and Kermanshah. This is in Iran. This is for those children who did not have surviving family members. The orphans were mostly Assyrian and Armenian. In Hamadan, Iran, we read about 230 unattended children were collected, and they were housed in a camp called Barak, where the Indian soldiers had been previously headquartered by the British. Rabbi Esther, who had been a teacher and principal in the schools in Urmia, was placed in charge of them. This is Hamadan, Iran, a picture of those orphaned girls. Hamadan, Iran, a picture of those orphan boys. Some of these orphans were carried away from Iran into the refugee Bakuba camp in Iraq. There was an orphanage for the children ages 5 to 14 who had lost both parents at the Bakuba refugee camp. There were close to 1,500 orphans in the camp. In fact, 1/3 of the total number of refugees were children. Girls and boys were placed in separate camps and were supervised by older women. The children attended classes and playgrounds were built for them. John Austin, the Bakuba refugee camp. These are the refugee girls from the Hakkari Highlands and the refugee Bakuba camp. Tabriz, this is in Iran, was the site of administration for all of Near Eastern relief work in Persia. Susan Shedd, the daughter of Dr. William Shedd, and Louise Wilbur Shedd made international news when she led 400 orphans to safety in Tabriz. Ms. Shedd became the orphanage director of all of Persia. This is a picture of the orphanage for boys, 1925, in Tabriz. Orphanages were also established in Baghdad after the Bakuba camp was closed by the British. And this is an eyewitness account, a lady that I interviewed myself in Turlock. She says, I came from the old country in 1928. My father was killed during World War I. My mom died on the road when we were fleeing. I was taken to an orphanage in Baghdad. I was 14 when my mother died. The orphanage was for Assyrians, but there were Armenians there too. There were about 200 girls and boys there. It was under American supervision. The orphans used to go to school. Each girl had a small job to do. Age ranged from 5 up. The supervisor was the daughter of Dr. Shedd. There were 2 Assyrian ladies. One was Rabbi, and that's a title for a teacher. Rabbi Rosa, she used to teach there. Arianne, Ishayu, unfamiliar faces in familiar places. There was a role reversal for the refugees who fled to Russia. Look what happens. Children of the Assyrian refugees in Russia were sent out as beggars in the streets of Russian towns. They brought food, clothes, and the money they got from begging and fed their parents. We will skip that because we don't have time. But I want to give you an example of the resilience that the victims of the genocide showed. In the 1980s, this old man here, Jesse Elias, told me about his family history with tears in his eyes. When he was a teenager, his parents were butchered, and his sister was rescued by Judat Khanam, that I mentioned before. Yet, he was a staunch Assyrian nationalist and in the leadership of both the church and the Assyrian Civic Club in Turlock. He raised sons and daughters who were all educated with university degrees, just like you are. You are the second or third generation of those uprooted people who survived the genocide. So he raised educated sons and daughters with university degrees. One of them was Dr. Joe Elias, a well-known physician and one of the founders and long-time board member of the Assyrian American Foundation in Berkeley, California. His granddaughter, Annie Elias, a third generation Assyrian, is following in the footsteps of her parents, and in collaboration with Dr. Ruth Kemper, is working on a project to preserve the Assyrian oral histories. The project is called Telling Our Stories. By the way, both Annie and Ruth are the descendants of orphaned children of the Assyrian genocide and a live example of Assyrian resistance against all odds. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Ishayu, for that moving presentation. We will take questions now. We have one in the back.
Coolest mic here I've seen. So, actually, I'm hoping I can ask a question of both Dr. Ishayu and Dr. Fixico in relation to Professor Hirsch's presentation. You both approached memory by anchoring it in real lived experiences of people and then explaining how those experiences continue to kind of go forward in history, right? Those experiences didn't end with the people who lived them, but had a kind of a persistence. And I'm thinking of the football speech, right? It's about the grandfathers, but it's still very real to the people experiencing it. And Professor Hirsch took a very different kind of approach, almost that the memories of the Holocaust are somehow disconnected from that real history. And her notion of repair was more or less to recognize that disconnection and stop trying to connect in the same way that we think of. What would your notions of repair be relative to memory? In other words, for her, I think it was, if you repair the memory, you've repaired the damage. I don't think that's what you're saying, but I'd like to hear from both of you what you think repair relative to the memory and the histories that you're talking about would be.
It's not uniform in all the survivors. Let me give you an example. Just that Joe Elias that I talked about, well, his sister was abducted by the Kurds, and God knows what they did to her. Afterwards, she was rescued. Now, when I went to interview Joe Elias, she was sitting in the room. Every time I would open my mouth, she would say, "Stop her." She was in total denial. She was so shamed. She did not want anything about the family to be known. So as you see, sometimes there is no repair. Absolutely no repair. And she sat there with a sour voice. She never got married. She was just an appendix to the family.
I wanted to clarify in relation to the question. I don't think we really differ as much as the questioner said in our approaches. I guess my point was not to disconnect from the real experiences, but to say that we've inherited these histories. They reverberate across generations. But my point or my hope was that we can use these memories or these post-memories, these reverberating, resonating traumas for fighting for social justice in the future and for trying to connect our histories rather than repeating the trauma and the violence across generations as inevitable. So I totally agree with the other two speakers that we have to call attention to this history and show what it does in the present. So playing cowboys and Indians is playing genocide. I completely agree with that. And I think the stories of these individual stories, really, we need to remind ourselves of that. But what does that memory do in the present? And that's the question I really wanted to ask.
I would only comment that when we look at history, and we've been trained academically, then we tend to look at events as events, and we disassociate ourselves from that event because we want to understand, to analyze the historical event. But the events are actually experiences. I mean, if you want to remember on a test, well, when was the War of 1812? And you just can't remember that. That was a joke. But think about studying that when you're drinking a cup of coffee at midnight or something like that. So you personalize trying to study the War of 1812 by associating yourself and an experience with the event. History is full of experiences, and the mind is a tricky thing. The mind is coyote sometimes because it will then kind of misremember on purpose. That's why oral tradition is so powerful, because you have to keep telling the same story over and over and over and over and not leave out any of the details so that it's told over and over and over. And we tend to not want to hear that, because what this week is about is really kind of the dark side of history. And that's the difficult part about it. But if we deny that, then we're denying part of our understanding of humanity and what we need to do to fix things so that such things, atrocities of the past, don't happen again. So we need to take stock.
Do we have more questions?
Hello.
Please go ahead.
I just have just a comment on the Shed family. Some interesting information. They were a prominent family from Chicago, and they did missionary work in the Middle East. And if you go to Chicago, the famous Shed Aquarium is named after them in the museum campus. And William Shed actually marched with the Assyrians from Iran to Bakuba and died on that march.
Yes.
With the genocide survivors.
Yes.
Just wanted to say that, yeah.
What's the question?
It was a comment.
Yes.
Yeah, I was wondering, why do you think, or why is the Assyrian genocide so underrepresented or so less well known by the general public?
The Assyrian genocide underrepresented and not recognized.
I don't know why.
Yes.
Because we don't have a company.
That's right.
It's as simple as that.
Okay. Any other questions? Okay, thank you.
So
Thank you.
can I ask a quick question?
Oh, sure, yes.
So, Don, I'm kind of, what's interesting to me, and my question goes probably a little bit the same as Henry's. In your work, right, about the native mind in the linear world, right, you suggest that there's really a different way, not only approaching the world, but also of memory that is not linear. Yet your co-panelists seem to suggest a much more linear idea of the transmission of memory. So I appreciated Marianne's Hirsch comment about, right, we do study the same phenomenon, and there's much more overlap than there's difference, but yet, in the very form of how to approach everything and memory, there seems to be a difference. So what would you make of that? Is that Is that real, or am I overthinking things here?
No, not really, because I wrote a book after a lot of confusion because I kept thinking, why is it that I, as an undergraduate, read the book differently? In grad school, in seminars, how is it that I read the book differently? And as a professor leading seminars, how is it that I read the book differently from the graduate students that I'm supposed to be teaching? And I finally thought about this after a lot of torment because I kept thinking, I'm wrong, I'm wrong, I'm wrong. Simply, it was a different approach to everything. And I had to kind of come with some kind of confidence to that point. And so I wrote the book, if I can remember the name of it. Sometimes that happens. It's called The American Indian Mind in a Linear World. And the two premises of it is that Native people, and I've had people come up and say, I get it. And I'm thinking, I don't think you're Native. But they're artists and they're musicians, and they get the gist of the book. And what the gist of the book is that one chapter based on is everything is circular. Everything is circular, patterns, growth, a bird's nest, the sun, moon, everything is circular. And we study and we look at things that way. And the other is more visual. I call it visual analysis. To look at something is not to see something as a single item, but to see something and to see it in the realm of its relationships to everything else in a holistic way. And if you think like that, then you think like me. But it seems like the rest of the mainstream doesn't get it because it's so linear oriented that way. And so people like myself have had to overcome that. But I can think both ways. And isn't that cool? But the linear thinking individuals, as we're trained academically, and I was trained in a linear fashion, needs to open its mind, because teachers who teach in the linear fashion have students that they're not aware of that think in a circular way, and they're not wrong. It's just a different way of thinking.
Can I just say, sorry, just a quick comment, it's not a question. I actually have a podcast on genocide studies, and I speak to a lot of people who are scholars in the field. And, we try to cover, my producer and I, we cover different areas where there's been conflict. We speak about Ubuntu, which is the African method of just looking at things differently. And I think I come from a small island in the middle of the Indian Ocean. And when I come to this part of the world, I am curious to know how we can put this into practice. That's what I want. Even when I speak to these people who talk about alternative methods, I think I've heard about it for a long time, but I want to see it in practice. And exactly what you're saying right now to me, of course, is very relevant, but I want to see how we can change academia in a very positive way if we can make this become more practical. That's what I yearn for more than anything. So that's just a comment.
In this book, what I write about is a cultural bridge of understanding. So as the linear thinking people study things, and then to try to get to the other side, then the people who are coming from this other way of thinking, from an indigenous way of thinking that's holistic, I theoretically kind of built a so we can extend over and invite you over, but then we can help you back. But I find that it had to be circular thinking philosophers or scholars, and like myself, we have to extend the bridge, because the linear way of thinking is so exclusive that it excludes other people, and that it's not inclusive. To be more circular in your thinking is to be more inclusive, because you're understanding everything, that in academic, we're more exclusive.
Yes.
I think there's one more question here. You want to go ahead?
Let me see if I can articulate this properly. So a lot of these talks were about the ways survivors of genocide and like the descendants of survivors sort of work to preserve the memory of these events. But what are some prescriptions for descendants of survivors who are, for some reason, not able to connect with that like side of their culture or family? Like for me personally, my mom is Native American, but she was adopted into a white family through a closed adoption. So I don't have any access to that part of my family. So is there any sort of advice that anyone might have for like remembering these events, even though we can't there's things missing that have been taken?
I would say it's always about things missing, because even if you have a direct familial connection, there's so much we don't really know. And I've made a distinction between familial post-memory and affiliative post-memory. I mean, even the family and familial inheritance is already imbricated in larger cultural structures. I mean, Professor Fixico talked about the films that, kind of structure our memory of Native American and Indian lives and also destruction, and falsify that history. But if you read Art Spiegelman's Mouse, it's all based on not just what his father said, but the images that have been circulating about this history that shape our understanding as much as other things. So there's so much history out there to be studied for you that that you can adopt. So I think it's kind of like a process of adoption. So it's not directly biological. So, and I think the affiliative is also a generational structure. So certain of us are become really, really interested and also passionate about learning about this past, often for very personal reasons, sometimes for personal reasons that we really, really don't know. So I think there's a lot to access and to study and to discuss with others and to experience, even if it's not directly transmitted within families.
Well, thank you so much. This was an amazing presentation. I think that's the last of the questions that we can take. Please join me in thanking this amazing panel, the organizers.
Okay, there's one more event tonight, up the 101 or on Zoom at the Valley of the Sun JCC. It's at from 7 to 9, Art in the Shadow of Death. So if that interests you, by all means. And just, again, want to thank everyone for coming out today. And I echo Professor Fixico with the energy in the room, especially like this youthful energy. And again, NAU people, thank you so much. I really do appreciate you. I got lots of flowers for you, and travel safely back up the mountain, and live in such a great place. We'll resume tomorrow at 9 a.m.